Welcome to episode 5 of season 4 of the Jordan B. Peterson podcast. My name is Mikhaila Peterson. This was an episode that I was involved in, and we spoke with Mark Manson. Mark Manson is the best-selling author of The Subtle Art of Not Giving a Fuck, and his more recent book, Everything is Fucked, a book about hope, as well as a very popular blogger. His books have sold over a whopping 13 million copies worldwide. The video version of this podcast is available if you search Mark Manson Jordan Peterson on YouTube. It's on my channel and clips are on Dad's. This was a fun episode. We discussed how to properly set goals, the destabilizing effects of social media, the value of committed relationships, and responsibility. Mark and Jordan compared experiences as authors that both fit into the self-help category and their search for meaning as men inside and outside of religion. This episode is brought to you by Lucy Nicotine. Lucy Nicotine makes gums and lozenges with 4 milligrams of nicotine in flavors like wintergreen, cinnamon, and pomegranate. I've noticed my friends using vapes and smoking more, especially given the stress of this year, particularly vapes. From what I've read, if you choose to consume nicotine, chewing it is actually going to be the safest way to get the effect without the downsides of inhaling it, of which there are many. If you're trying to go the healthier route, I'd recommend these. I also know some biohackers who use nicotine for concentration enhancement, although be aware, it's addictive. However, if you're going to use it, Lucy Nicotine is a better way to go. It's 2021. Get rid of your cigarettes, unplug your vape, throw out your dip. Does anyone even use that anymore? And get some Lucy Nicotine gum or lozenges. A subscription to Lucy Nicotine ships directly to your door each month. Go to lucy.co and use promo code Peterson to get 20% off all products, including gum or lozenges. That's lucy.co, promo code Peterson at checkout. Warning, this product contains nicotine derived from tobacco. Nicotine is an addictive chemical. That's lucy.co, and be sure to use promo code Peterson. This episode is also brought to you by goodoldthinker.org, the website where you can read or listen to great books in bite-sized pieces, basically book summaries. But they're incredibly well done. They summarize the key ideas from new and noteworthy nonfiction, giving you access to an entire library of great books in bite-sized form. You can read or listen to hundreds of titles in a matter of minutes, from old classics like Dale Carnegie's How to Win Friends and Influence People to recent bestsellers. I use it frequently after I read a book to try and really remember the key points, especially before a podcast episode. If you want to get into reading and you don't have enough time, or let's be honest, enough self-discipline, thinker.org can really help you out. If you want to challenge your preconceptions, expand your horizons, and become a better thinker, go to thinker.org. That's thinkr.org to start a free trial today. Again, that's thinkr.org. If you enjoyed this episode, please rate and subscribe. And thanks everyone for the support this week after the Times fiasco. It was a very stressful week all around, but onwards and upwards as usual. Have a wonderful week. Mark Manson, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
How many books have you sold?
Oh, I mean, if you add them all up, I think it's like 13 million, 14 million.
Okay. So that's a lot. That's a lot of books. I wanted to get you on because you sold a lot of books, and online they usually underestimate books sold. So I wanted to hear the real number. And yeah. I read the book, and so I'm going to say a couple of things. One, I don't think it resonated with me like it did to 13 million people. And I knew that it sold a ton of books, so I figured I'm an outlier, and I wanted to figure out why and kind of delve a little bit more into your ideas. But one of the things, and I think it might be somewhere that you differ from my dad, but I also might be misinterpreting what you wrote. So I'd like some clarification. But you talk a lot about how people shouldn't necessarily shoot too high because you can end up chasing some dream. And you use the example of the man who left Metallica and formed Megadeth and felt like a failure. And most people would say he's not a failure because he formed Megadeth, but he got kicked out of Metallica. So the comparison was off. So from what I learned growing up with my dad was kind of aim for the highest thing you can reasonably aim for, and shoot for that. And in my experience, that's been that's worked for me. So is that different from what you say in your book? Hopefully that was clear enough and not too jumbled.
Sure. And I think there are a few questions there. We can kind of take them one at a time. But the goal question, I'm not critical of necessarily, say, the distance of the goals. I think there's a lot of there can be many advantages to, say, shooting for the moon or whatnot. Kind of the cautionary tale of Dave Mustaine and Megadeth is more of be careful of the direction of your goals. It's I think kind of what I'm critical of in both of my books is people just taking kind of the cultural definitions of success and doing good or whatever for whatever that is at face value and not really questioning if I do achieve these things, will that actually solve my problems? Will that actually make me any happier? Will it bring any more meaning to my life? So the issue isn't so much don't take on ambitious goals. It's more of be very careful and skeptical of your goals because it's that intense dedication to a goal. It's a very powerful thing, and so if you're pointed in the wrong direction,
well,
it can do some damage.
The man who founded Megadeth and who ended up unhappy because he wasn't as popular as Metallica. He got trapped in a very unlikely situation because he was staggeringly successful, but unfortunately compared himself to a group that was even more staggeringly successful. Reminded me of someone I knew once who was upset about how much progress he had made by the time he was 40 compared to his roommate in college.
Yeah.
And this person was a successful serial entrepreneur and a mover and shaker in his own right, intellectually and practically, but his roommate was Elon Musk. And to some degree, you have to write that off as just bad luck. Right. I think the founder of Megadeth broke a rule that I wrote about in 12 Rules for Life, which was compare yourself to who you were yesterday and not to who someone else is today. And I wrote that rule partly as a consequence of realizing that you could end up in the situation of the Megadeth founder. You pick someone whose attributes are so stellar in relationship to your own that the probability that you'll make that bar is extraordinarily low, whereas you could improve over where you were yesterday, and that's actually useful, which is necessary, but also attainable.
Yeah, absolutely. And I just feel like a lot of people's kind of default setting is to in the book, I talk about metrics, how we kind of invent metrics for ourselves to define what success is going to be. And I think for a lot of us, our default setting is to define our metric by whatever the people around us are doing or have recently done. And so if you're not consciously questioning that, it can get you into trouble.
Yeah, well, it's a double-edged sword, though, too, because, of course, the person who doesn't compare what he or she is doing to what other people are doing also can take on the attributes of a psychopath. We can't help but judge our own actions and emotions and reactions against those reactions of the people around us because we have to get along with them. And so we take into account what our family thinks and what our broader community thinks. And that can lead us astray at times, but it also frequently serves as a corrective and stops us from going down a bad path that's defined by our weakest personal point. So you often get a situation where a perfectly reasonable strategy that works in many situations can produce bad outcomes in certain situations. And maybe that's why you need a diversity of strategies.
Yeah, I know I've found, and a lot of the people I've talked to over the years, and I'm curious if you found this to be true, that some people tend to be very good at using metrics based on themselves, and they kind of ignore the world around them, and they take on, as you mentioned, maybe they're not a psychopath, but they kind of develop narcissistic qualities in terms of they just see everything in terms of their own desires and their own metrics. And then there are other people who only see things in terms of the metrics of the people around them. They're very bad at developing metrics of success for themselves. And I mean, my take has always been that a healthy individual is able to do and hold on to both simultaneously. And that's a struggle for most people. I think most people are coming from one of those two directions to get to that healthy place. Well, I don't know if you agree with that or.
Well, it is one of the constant battles that everybody undertakes in their life to get the balance between their own self-interest and the interests of others correct. And it's easy to err on one side or the other. I think agreeable people, technically speaking, they're empathic and compassionate and polite. And when they make an error, their error is that they sacrifice themselves too much for other people's interests. Now, that has some real advantages. For example, when you're taking care of infants, at least to some degree, you can't wear yourself to a frazzle, but there is a certain amount of self-sacrificial necessity involved in taking care of infants because they're always right and you have to respond to them in that manner. It doesn't work very well when you're dealing with adults. And then people who are disagreeable, well, they tend to be more self-serving and they can run into problems because they don't take other people into account enough. But it's not easy. It's not easy to tell when you've got that balance right, because it also changes to some degree from situation to situation. And so
of course, yeah.
your temperament can give you an approximation, but that doesn't mean that it's going to be correct in every particular situation.
You talked a bit about surrounding yourself with people and then like figuring out, I guess, your goals based on everyone around you. But something Mark talked about fairly extensively in his book was social media. And so part of the problem with judging your behavior off of others nowadays is you can surround yourself with weird groups of people, and there are like 100,000 of them that will agree with you.
Yeah, Mark, you talked about that a little bit more in Everything is Fucked, your book about hope, about the effect of social media and its destabilizing effect. And I mean, I've seen that happen more and more over recent years where we just, as Mikhaila pointed out, we just discussed the fact that you can use other people's opinions to help you defend yourself against your own foolish excesses. But now that can go astray very badly because you can go online and no matter what conspiratorial or paranoid twist your thinking has happened to take, you can find a group of people, a large group of people who share your viewpoint and who provide all sorts of evidence that it's true. And so I don't know of any hard data on this, but I've certainly seen a rise in conspiratorial and paranoid thinking among my family members and friends, and I think in the broader community as well over the last year. And that means one of the mechanisms that serves as a corrective for us has gone astray, at least in part because of this new technology.
But was the moon landing really real, though?
Well, that exactly.
I mean, I haven't seen hard data either, but I did see something that said that the Flat Earth Society has grown by like 1,200% over the last few years.
Wow.
And to me, that just kind of says everything, right?
Right. That's a really good example.
If you were a flat earther 50 years ago, all your friends and family would kind of laugh at you and tell you you're ridiculous and you'd move on with your life. But now, there's all sorts of communities and groups and YouTube channels that you can hop onto and they'll sit there and tell you that you're right.
Was it Mrs. Krabappel on The Simpsons who told Ralph that the children were right to laugh at him?
Yes.
Yeah, well, one of the things I argue for in my new book, which is called Beyond Order, is that we frequently outsource the problem of sanity. For the psychoanalysts, for example, and for most clinical psychological thinkers, sanity was a characteristic of the integrity of your own psychological structures, or maybe even the health of you as an organism. But I think that misses an important source of sanity, and that is that if you behave reasonably well, so if you're reasonably well socialized and you can hold your tongue and not be too annoying to others and maybe occasionally helpful, then you'll be surrounded by other people and they will hint to you continually when you're going off on a inappropriate tangent. And everyone knows people who can't take a social hint. When I've taught seminars, for example, at the university, there'll be 20 kids, 20 students in the seminar, and there's almost invariably one of them who is completely opaque to social cues and who will kill a conversation stone dead within seconds of entering it because they don't know how to play the game properly. And they're not functioning well, not so much because their internal psychic structure doesn't have the appropriate integrity, but because they can't avail themselves of social cues. They're not acceptable to others, and so they can't benefit from the collective intelligence of the group, which is generally, but not always, telling you how to be sane. Now, it doesn't always work because sometimes the group goes insane. And then, the same person is the person. Yeah, everybody. And well, you see that very often. You saw that in Nazi Germany, for example. And you see that in these conspiratorial groups that are popping up everywhere as well now. So a lot of this intellectual endeavor that you've been engaged in over the course of these last 2 books was reminiscent to me of what I was involved in when I was, I think, probably almost exactly your age. Maybe we started at about the same age, but you're investigating, as far as I can tell, the relationship between value structures and emotion. That seems to be your fundamental concern. Is that reasonable? And you made the conclusion that...
Yeah, I'd say that's accurate.
That your values determine your emotional states.
Generally speaking, yeah.
And then the question arises, what constitutes a valid value? And you investigate that even more thoroughly in your second book, relying on philosophers, for example, like Nietzsche and Kant. And so the question of what constitutes an acceptable value structure is an incredibly deep question. And maybe part of the reason that your books have been successful is because so many people are asking that question now. What?
I think so. Sorry. I'm anticipating your question, which I assume is why is that?
Well, and what's it done for you? This investigation.
Well, that's an interesting question because I've always seen my work, and my background is blogging. I don't have an academic background in this stuff like you do. But I started blogging in 2008, and initially I kind of used it as my own vehicle for personal development, growth, developing emotional intelligence, managing relationships, all these things. And so kind of the way my career has unspooled is whatever issue I'm kind of struggling with at that period of my life, I investigate it and then I write about it and the writing is kind of my own personal form of digestion, I suppose. And I just kind of have this faith that if I'm going through it, then there must be a lot of other people going through it as well.
I actually think that's the answer to why your book was so successful, is that it is the case that there's a large population of people who have the same questions that you do and are stumped in the same way that you are or were, and that you're leading them through a process of investigation and thought at exactly the level that's there's this idea from developmental psychology that a man named Vygotsky originated called the zone of proximal development. And adults speak to infants and toddlers with implicit knowledge of the zone of proximal development. And what they do is speak at a level that's slightly more advanced than the infant or toddler can understand. And that leads them, so they can mostly understand the adult speech, but not quite. And that leads them further, right? They can understand, but they're also forced to develop further understanding. And I've noticed when I was teaching that it was often the case that when I was trying to figure something out, that was the best time to teach it rather than after I had figured it out, because then I would have forgot what the problem was and also what I didn't know.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. I think part of it is, this is kind of the hypothesis I lay out in the book, and it's something I still believe, but I think when you live in a society where information is no longer scarce, where there's essentially more stuff for you to consume and understand and learn about than is humanly possible. The most obvious question becomes, what is worth pursuing? What is worth learning about? What is worth trusting and believing in? I think if you look at previous generations, information was scarce, opportunities were more scarce. And so people had kind of from an early point in their life, a more clear path of what they should be following, and what they should be learning about. And I think today, starting with millennials and even more so with Gen Z, it's, we've grown up with this overabundance of information and opportunity of paths, life paths to choose for ourselves. And so it kind of, on paper, that sounds like a great thing, and it is a great thing in a lot of ways, but it also kind of invites these existential questions of what is worth pursuing. And I just found that, myself and a lot of my peers and friends kind of went into what most people would call midlife crisis in our 20s. And for me, writing Subtle Art was kind of writing my way out of that. It was, as you said, investigating these value structures, going back to the philosophers and trying to understand, what their ideas around these things were. And it's, for me, it kind of, you asked me, your original question was, what did it do for me? For me, it gave me a sense of, sense that I understood where I was, I guess. I guess it helped me create like a map of how to navigate my life. And so with Subtle Art, it was kind of, I wanted to provide the right questions for a layperson, somebody who's not going to go read Nietzsche, or somebody who's not going to study existentialism, to ask the right questions that will kind of help them do the same thing in a more basic way.
How do you talk about the average person in your book? To you, what does the average person look like? Are you the average person?
I don't think so. No.
Okay. I agree.
Yeah. I think the average person does not have the time or the interest for a lot of these questions, yet they still struggle with them. Okay. I think the average person has a generic middle-class job, maybe partially college educated, but not always, and feels these things. They feel kind of the social fabric unwinding underneath them. They see things on social media and on the news that is confusing and upsetting, but they don't have the time. They haven't had the time to investigate these things further. And so those are kind of one way I think of, you started this off asking, Mikhaila, you said you didn't identify with my work as much as
13 million
most other people. Yeah. I mean, one way I think about it is I'm asking many similar questions, or bringing up a lot of similar points to your dad, but I think I'm translating it down further. It's more organized and packaged for mass consumption, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that was a solid answer, actually. That was good. Okay, and then this is just a simple question. Well, maybe. What do you mean? Like, what are you supposed to give a fuck about, according to you? Is it different for each person, or are there rules people can kind of follow to figure it out?
I intentionally don't answer that question because I don't feel it's right for me to impose my values on any of my readers. I do simply, at times in the book, I offer kind of what I've discovered is better or worse to give a fuck about for myself. And I do provide...
I'm going to harass you about that in a minute or two. So I thought I'd warn you about that. So you can prepare.
Thanks for the warning.
Yeah, no problem.
I do lay out, I think, some principles that I generally, I think, find to be useful, so generally it's more useful to focus on kind of what it's not the most sophisticated terms, but internal values versus external values, so focus on things that occur inside of you, focus on your own integrity, focus on your own honesty. These are things that you experience internally versus, say, things that you experience externally, external markers of validation.
What would that be? Like fame? Is that an example you
money
used?
Yeah, so money, social media followers, things like that, having a nice car. There's nothing wrong with those, but it's similar to the discussion we were having earlier. Like we all like money, we all like having nice things, but there needs to be you can't only value those things. Like you have to have a balance of kind of more internally driven things that you care about.
So I do think that you impose your values on your readers. But I actually think, I'm going to make two observations. The first is that I think that apologizing for that is the most predictable thing that a millennial could possibly do. Because I think your generation, and perhaps even more the generation younger than you, what they've been taught above all else is that the cardinal moral sin is to judge, to be judgmental, right? To be discriminating. But that's absolutely foolish. And you actually make a case for that because you say that one of the most important things that you can do, and by you mean you, but you also mean other people, is to say no. And that as soon as you value one thing, which you need to do, and hopefully the proper thing, you're saying no to a very large number of other things. And so this is why the stance of the idea that you can raise being non-judgmental to the level of a higher moral virtue is definitely wrong. If your claim is correct, that your emotional state depends on your value structure, and it's more important than anything else to get your value structure straight, and if you have a value structure, you have to say yes to some things and no to others, then you immediately admit that there's a value hierarchy and there's some things at the top and some things at the bottom. And I think one of the real strengths of your book is that you at least begin to do that. And I think you do it explicitly. So you say quite straightforwardly that there are 5 things that you've discovered that are of general utility, that you've found of general utility. And you don't say that you're certain that you're 100% right about those 5 things. But you certainly make the claim that the reader should take them seriously and that they've been useful to you. And that was taking responsibility. And you do a very careful job of distinguishing that from accepting universal fault, which is a good piece of intellectual exercise because it's necessary to take responsibility and to discriminate that from assuming universal fault. You can get cancer, and it's not necessarily your fault. In fact, it probably isn't. But you still have to take responsibility for it, or suffer the consequences. You talk about the necessity to accept and cultivate the ability to tolerate, to accept uncertainty and to cultivate the ability to tolerate it. You talk about learning to appreciate failure. You talk about rejection, we already mentioned that, and the ability to say no, and the necessity of saying no, and perhaps the unapologetic necessity of saying no. And you also, you make that concrete in some sense because you talk about, for example, that you learned as you transition from your 20s to your 30s that saying no to an entire smorgasbord, let's say, of sexual possibilities was worthwhile because you found something deeper in the commitment to a single person. And that's a form of sacrifice. You talk about sacrifice in your second book. And, you made a sacrifice, and sacrifices are actually worthwhile. And then you talk about contemplation of your own mortality as a way of discriminating between what's important and what isn't. And then in your second book, you talk about both Nietzsche and Kant in some detail, and both of them were striving for the apprehension of something approximating a universal morality. And so I can see that. Yep. And you also mention Ernest Becker, Becker believed that.
All right, you got me.
Well, what do you say to that?
Yeah. You got me. Well, you totally, no, you are right. It's funny because, so now I'm kind of doing like a check of my, because you are right. You are correct. I think, and I'm going to admit here, I gave you guys the stock answer there,
that's a dangerous thing to do.
I know, well, especially with you guys, but I've been asked a million times, people are like, oh, so what should we give a fuck about? And my de facto answer has always been like, well, it's not my place to tell people exactly what their values should be.
That's definitely bullshit. That's definitely not true. That's exactly what you're trying to do. Now,
and 13 million people are listening.
I think the reason you get away with it is because you're trying to do it for yourself too. You're not preaching.
And you're kind of inferring, right? You say, this is what worked for me, but it could work for you.
Right.
Yeah. And let me present some context to this, which I think can be helpful. My background is straight up just the self-help world. And generally in the self-help world, values are just shoved down your throat. You're supposed to want the fancy car. You're supposed to want the perfect marriage. You're supposed to want to be happy and live happily ever after. It's like, these are the things that are taken for granted at page one. And so, when I wrote Subtle Art, I went through pains to kind of be contrarian in a lot of ways to what a typical self-help book is. And so one of those ways was, I don't want to explicitly ram values down people's throats, but I agree with you that the overarching project of the book is, yes, I am imposing, even if I don't come out and say it, like, this is what you should give a fuck about. It's the way I've constructed the book, and particularly the second book. The second book is much more striving for some sort of solid structure to believe in.
That's this book, by the way.
Yeah.
Just so everybody knows. Well, you hooked yourself into this project as soon as you made that initial discovery. Like, you made quite a profound discovery in my estimation, which was that values regulate emotion.
Yeah.
So then as soon as you make that discovery, you're stuck with a question, which is, okay, then what are the appropriate values
that make me happy?
Well, or even, well, if it's not happy, it's some other metric, because you could also question whether or not happy is the right ultimate value.
I like happiness. I know you're like, it's not about being happy, but.
Well, it beats the hell out of being miserable. If happiness comes along, you should be bloody happy that it's like lit on your stem for a while.
Yeah.
Yeah. But and then as soon as you get into that question, it's turtles all the way down, right? Like, that takes you into, kind of staring into the void, so to speak, which you talk about in your work quite a bit of how there's, you have to take on the responsibility to create something that's meaningful in your life.
Yes, or to discover it. That's one of the weaknesses of Nietzsche, I think. I mean, I'm a great admirer of Nietzsche, and I've never read anyone who could think with as much glittering brilliance as Nietzsche, and he's very dangerous to read because he's so unbelievably intelligent. He'll take everything you know apart, sometimes with a sentence. He said once, he was bragging in a sort of self-deprecatory manner in some sense. I mean, he never sold any books, and so he was sort of bragging to himself, I suppose. He said, I can say in a sentence what it takes other people in an entire book to say, what they can't say in an entire book. And that actually happens to be true. Nietzsche could, in fact, do that. And he believed that we could create our own values, but that's wrong. We can't create our own values. We can discover them, and we can co-create them, but and you know this in your book as well. It comes out again implicitly. You wouldn't be able to violate your conscience if you could create your own values. Right?
Violate your conscience?
Yeah, because your conscience, you'll
lower this for me a little bit.
You'll do something that your conscience objects to.
Okay.
And if you were fully capable of creating your own values, your conscience would never object. You would just go along with what you'd proposed. Like if we were the sorts of creatures that could do that. But what we find very rapidly is we try very hard to impose our own values. And then it fails. We're not satisfied by what we're pursuing, or we become extremely guilty, or we become ashamed, or we're hurt, or we hurt other people. And sometimes that doesn't mean we're wrong, but most often it does. And so your search for bedrock, I think, is, and perhaps the fact that you never do come to any final conclusion, is definitely, at least in my opinion, so maybe not definitely, but in my opinion, a large part of the reason why your books are attractive. You know, the millennials, you talk about the consumer literature that shows that people who have an infinite variety of choices are less happy than people who only have one or two. And you mentioned at the beginning of this discussion that the millennial generation that you're a part of suffered in some sense because they weren't deprived enough and had too many choices. The advantage to being deprived is that it's obvious what to do. Like if you're starving, then you eat. There's no question. But if you have enough to eat, and you have enough shelter, and you have enough information, maybe not as much as you could have, but enough, it starts to become difficult to decide what to do. And then you have another problem, which is that you can't decide what to do. And then you have to start to investigate value. And that seems to me, even from your autobiographical comments, seemed to be what happened with you and obviously so many other people.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And I think that plays into kind of what we were talking about, the kind of the radical subcultures that exist and percolate online. You know, I feel like a lot of people are going through these existential malaise and they're searching. And so they're just scrolling through social media and they find something that piques their interest, seems counterintuitive or exciting, and suddenly they're kind of whisked down this rabbit hole without much awareness of what's happening. One
of the reasons that I'm a rather staunch admirer of traditional Christianity, say even in its Catholic form, let's say, which is the most traditional form, arguably, is that I think that Catholicism is as sane as people can get. Like
weren't there areas of Catholicism that were a little out there?
There still are. I mean, the doctrine is very difficult to understand. The idea of the virgin birth, for example, and all of the strange irrationality that goes along with a religious belief. But the problem is that we need something structured and irrational to protect us from even less structured and more irrational beliefs. That's my sense of it. We can't live in a fully rational world because we're not smart enough. We need something to fill in the gaps. And the advantage of a codified religion is at least that there's a unifying force behind it. And what you get now is this fragmentation and search for replacement for religious values. And there's not much difference. Well, a conspiratorial theory will offer exactly that, but none of the true benefits of a religious system, you know, one that's evolved over time and that has a deep basis.
Well, Mark, did you argue that some of the values you kind of inferred could potentially replace that?
The religious values, you mean? Or, well, one of the concerns I raised in Everything is Fucked is that is what Jordan just said, which is, I think people, in lieu of religion, they are taking worldly values, things like politics, cultural issues, social group identities, and behaving religiously around them, adopting kind of religious belief systems around them. And that's extremely concerning to me. I mean, you don't have to read far back in history to see how that ends up bad.
See, an organized religion, this is something that Carl Jung really recognized, and he was an astute critic of Nietzsche and also an admirer of Nietzsche, is that we do have a profound religious impulse. And that I'm not saying that that's good or that it's bad. I'm saying that something has to be done with it. And the advantage to a genuine religion is that it's very, very complicated.
Well, the alternatives don't seem great.
Yes.
It's been back-tested for 2,000 years.
Well, and there's something at the core of it. There's an ideal, like in Christianity, there's the idea of the ideal human being. That's Christ, whose mode of being offers redemption.
He had a miserable time, though.
Well, people do have a miserable time, though. And that's one of the things that makes it powerful.
Back to the happiness thing. Back to the happiness.
So there's a striving there to specify what that ideal constitutes. And this is something that Ernest Becker got wrong too, as far as I'm concerned. So Becker believed that our attempts to weave together a heroic narrative were motivated by our denial of death. And that's true, but it's not true enough, because what Becker didn't understand or didn't realize, and I liked The Denial of Death, I thought it was a great book, was that a lot of our heroic projects actually stave off death as well. So they may have the symbolic value of providing us with symbolic immortality, but they have the practical value of us not dying. And so if you adopt a mode of life that is practical, it gives you a sense of meaning, but that's not because that's somehow papering over your fear of death. It's because it actually provides you with a meaningful way of being in a world that's rife with uncertainty and mortality. You can't write that all off as psychological. And that comes through in your book, the fact that you know that. Like, one thing I'm really curious about, this commitment issue that you raised, because it seemed to me, and I might be wrong, but tell me if I'm barking up the wrong tree. It seemed to me that it was quite a revelation to you that being in a committed monogamous relationship would bring you as much satisfaction and happiness as it did compared to a more libertine lifestyle. So is that a reasonable observation?
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
Huge epiphany.
Okay, so two questions.
Mm-hmm.
The first is, what did you discover that you didn't know? What is it that being in a committed relationship did for you that you didn't realize it might do beforehand?
So there are two sides of that. There's kind of the alleviation of the negative and the positive side of it. So I think, back before I had that experience, my kind of irrational gut reaction to intimacy in general was, I'm going to be trapped. This person's going to expect too much of me. I'm going to disappoint them. I'm going to hurt them. I'm going to hurt myself. It's better if we just kind of go our separate ways.
Right. It's better if you keep it shallow.
Exactly. It's safer. I think the first epiphany was that's not necessarily true. You're not necessarily going to, the world's not going to end if you have a fight, and you're not going to ruin each other's lives, and you're not going to be trapped all the time. There's a different, and this kind of leads into the positive side of the epiphany, which is that there's a different kind of freedom in commitment, which is the freedom to, like, one way I described it in an article many years ago was that it felt like if my brain was a computer, it felt like I had a program running in the background, and this program in the background was constantly thinking and worrying about which women were single, which ones were interested in me, which ones were attracted to me, which ones I was attracted to. And it was kind of just eating up a lot of RAM in my brain. And as soon as I hit that point, it was actually almost instantaneous when I proposed to my wife. It's like that program just shut down, and suddenly my computer, like my brain, had like 30% more energy to focus on other things. And I realized the feeling was of liberation. It was like, wow, I never, like, this is solved. I never have to think about this stuff ever again. I never have to worry about it.
That's the problem with a too easy divorce route. One of the advantages to being married is precisely what you just described, is that it solves a set of problems so that you don't have to consider them anymore. But if divorce looms as a too easy exit, then every time you have a fight, you can think, well, I can just dissolve this relationship. And although from some perspectives, you could say that that increases your freedom. From another perspective, you'd say, well, no, it doesn't. It just reintroduces you to the whole bloody set of problems that the marriage was designed to solve. And it is very perverse in some sense, although this is part of the meaning of sacrifice, is that you can give up a whole set of options and focus on something narrowly. And what the consequence of that is whole new worlds open up for you that you didn't know were there. You don't lose any freedom at all. In fact, you tend to gain it. So, okay, so commitment. Now, you emphasize commitment in your book in more than just the marital domain, though, but more implicitly, I would say, because your insistence that people develop the ability to say no and that that's necessary, which is your defense for discrimination, by the way, that also that implies a broadening of the appreciation for commitment, is you have to commit to some set of values or you're swamped by chaos is essentially the situation.
Yes. Yeah, so that epiphany of kind of commitment in the romantic space or in the intimate relationship space, I quickly saw that you can apply that in other areas of life. You know, it's a deep commitment to, say, a career path is liberating in a lot of ways because it removes distractions and extraneous options and things that may, waste your energy. And so I argue towards the end of Everything is Fucked that there's that I think are kind of our, especially here in the US, we have this worship of freedom for its own sake. And I think the definition of freedom in the US often gets very warped, of just having lots of stuff or being able to do lots of stuff. And it's what I discovered is that kind of the traditional ideas of freedom and liberty and things like that from the Enlightenment was much more of this like virtuous, having a freedom to decide who you are, having a freedom, discipline was seen as a form of freedom.
That's the freedom to choose your own shackles.
Yeah.
Yeah. And you talk about that with choosing what, I'm not going to say this properly, but setting a goal and deciding how much pain you can tolerate to accomplish that goal and being okay with it. Because you said, people want to be a CEO and they don't want to work 80-hour weeks. Like they don't understand. I don't know what that had to do with what you guys were just saying. Something.
It's totally a part of that. And in fact, I think this is I think the one reframe, if you were to take one kind of reframe from my work that I think has resonated the most, I've taken kind of that classic self-help motivational speaker question of like, what do you want in life? Do you want the corner office? Do you want to have a boat? Do you want to have 10 kids in an amazing garage? Like whatever you want. And twisting that over and saying, okay, what are the problems you want in your life?
Yeah.
Because there's no escaping problems and struggle. And it's easy to want the benefits of something without wanting the costs. And so you need to ask yourself, like, what are the costs that I'm okay with? Because that's actually a much better indication of A, what you're going to be successful at, and B, what actually makes you different from other people. What actually distinguishes you as a person and kind of can form your identity.
You do a bit of investigation into the sacrificial motif in your second book. I believe it's mostly in the context of false religions. But you make a case, it's just something I'd like to point out because it's part of where it seems to me that your thinking is going, is that the case you're making is that you can tell what you want by observing what you're willing to sacrifice for it.
Yes.
And sacrifice, modern people have a very shallow notion of what sacrifice constitutes. Sacrifice is, in fact, how you please the gods. And archaic people acted that out because they were struggling to bring to consciousness the knowledge that it was necessary to give up something that you valued in the present to gain something that you valued even more in the future. And maybe they acted that out by offering up a choice cut of meat to God, and that seems pretty barbaric and archaic to us, but that was the birth of a tremendous idea. And the tremendous idea was the observation that if you gave up something you valued, you could bargain with the future. And that's like the most amazing discovery that human beings ever made. It's like the discovery of the utility of work. A little pain now will pay off in the future. It's equivalent to the discovery of the future. It's no trivial thing. So then the question becomes, what is it worth? What is it that's worth sacrificing for? And you found in your own life that commitment was one of those things.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I've become an ardent zealot for marriage. It's funny because my career actually started in men's dating advice, and I still get emails all the time from young people who, they say, what's the point of marriage? Like, what's the point of settling down? What's the point of being with one person? And I feel like I've become a very unlikely just preacher for the benefits of commitment.
The more people that you take to bed, the more you're with one person. And that person is yourself. Because all those relationships are exactly the same. The fact that they happen to be different bodies is trivial compared to the depth of realization that you obtain by getting to know one person really well. There's no comparison. And it's very sad in some sense that young people have a question such as, what's the value of marriage? That should be, if our education system, if our socialization systems were operating properly, that would be self-evident. It's part of what makes your life worthwhile to go all in on something. Well, one of the things I wanted to ask you on a more personal level, you and I are similar in that we've both written books about value, and they're both, I suppose, in the self-help genre with some detours into philosophy and psychology. I found this very difficult, the consequences of this very difficult in some sense. It saddened me terribly because so many people have talked to me about how mixed up their lives were and how the words of encouragement that I've offered have helped them put their lives together. And that's a very positive thing. On the one hand, because I can be pleased that my work has been helpful, but it's also very painful, on the other hand, to get a real glimpse into how much of a longing there is out there for guidance of any sort. And how much of a lack there is of that. And that's been very hard on me to see that over and over and over and over. And I don't know if you've experienced anything like that, delving into the same realm.
Yeah, it can be heartbreaking at times. I very consciously kind of manage my exposure to it.
How do you do that?
I schedule reader email, essentially. And I have an assistant who kind of screens everything, gets rid of the trolls and the hate mail and the spam and stuff like that. So I have a folder that it's pretty, that she moves certain emails into. And it's, when I open that folder, I know that I'm going to get pretty personal and heavy stuff. It's not all negative. Sometimes it's great life-changing stuff. And so there's there's a mix there.
Well, it's generally positive. The stories that I'm often stopped on the street, and so that's it's not as easy an encounter to control. And I mean, I'm not complaining about it because people who stop me on the street are almost invariably polite beyond belief, and I've had very, very few negative interactions. But that doesn't mean it isn't heartbreaking, because people reveal the cataclysmic conditions of their life very rapidly, in a very intimate way. And
you need a burqa. I'd solve that problem real fast.
Can you imagine the headlines? Jordan Peterson wears a burqa.
Yeah, well, I've tried a hat and sunglasses from time to time, but that's not as effective a solution.
No, it's it can be heartbreaking, and it's, well, you know, sometimes I don't know what to say sometimes, and a lot of times I simply respond with, you know, I'm listening. I don't know what to do in this situation, you know, my audience is, because, you know,
listening
so much of my audience
to do.
It is, but it's, you know, my audience is very international, and so I'll get emails from like a girl in rural India who says, my parents are making me marry a 50-year-old man who I've never met before. I don't know what to do. Should I run away? And I'm like, you know, I struggle with that. Like, how do you even respond to that? And so there's a lot, and it can go to pretty dark places. And so, yeah, I just kind of, I set aside a certain time of my week. I'm definitely not as recognizable as you. I don't get stopped on the street. I don't do many live events, so I don't get it as much in person. But in terms of like the emails and stuff, I've just kind of learned to kind of, you know, all right, Sunday afternoon is for these few hours, like that's where I'm going to dive into this emotional space.
Yeah, that's intense. You do get approached quite a bit. Okay. So your second book, changing the topic, something a little bit lighter, trying to keep it light. It's hard to keep things light with you around. You know, like interjective. Like, oh my God, the atmosphere is getting heavy.
I've noticed that being around me 100% of the time.
Your second book about hope, which is something people are seriously having a problem with this year. Like, everybody is so depressed. Do you have suggestions for, I guess, maybe suggestions for what not to do? That might be easier for people than what to do. Yeah.
Well, it's funny because that book is a bit of a Trojan horse. I think it lures people in with the promise of hope, but what it actually gives people is a long lesson of be careful what to hope for. You know, it's, I think kind of the main point of that book is when you're desperate for hope, the more desperate you are for something to hope for, I think the more liable you are to just grasp at anything that comes around, and just dive in head first. And I think that can get people into trouble. And so it's very much a book of trying to provide context for people to be more aware of what visions of hope they're buying into, what belief systems they're buying into, what information they're spending their time on, and trying to focus more locally, focus more on themselves and the people in their immediate vicinity, you know, get off news, get off social media. Don't buy into the latest outrage that's, you know, being spread everywhere. And essentially just focus on the things that you can actually have immediate impact on. When I did the speaking events for that book, you know, one of the big arguments I made is I think there's a real argument to say that we have become too globally minded. The fact that we're so aware of what's happening in India and Australia and Japan and Russia and all these places, like, it makes us feel helpless in a lot of ways. I think there's a lot to be said of returning a majority of our attention share to the things immediately around us, to our family, our community, the local school, the kids down the street, things like that. Those are the things that we have actual immediate impact on. And though they're not sexy or glamorous and they don't travel well online, but those are the sorts of hopes that you can actually see come to fruition.
Well, you also outline something very practical as far as I'm concerned with regards to hope. It's like, so imagine that you're talking to someone who's hopeless, but who isn't suffering from a fatal, painful disease, let's say. So their hopelessness is more a matter of disorientation than a condition brought about by chronic pain or something like that. We'll leave that aside. The first thing that might be offered to someone like that is to say that if you don't know what to do, you should try doing what other people have always done. And so what might that mean? It might mean, well, do you have a job? And if the answer is no, you might be encouraged to take small steps towards getting a job. Now, you concentrate on doing, right? You said when you're in doubt, do something, even a small thing. Okay, so you could say, well, look, you're not going to generate yourself a functioning value hierarchy that's optimally tuned to your personality in the next week. It's going to be a lifelong endeavor of approximation, and you're going to get a lot of it wrong. And you talked about tolerance for error in your first book. So you're going to get a lot of it wrong, but you got to start somewhere. So let's start with what people have agreed upon universally. And this is simple. It's like, you should probably get up in the morning. You should probably go to bed at night. You should probably have some friends. You should probably have a family. Probably have a job. Wouldn't hurt to pursue some education. And, you can raise objections to any of those. And you might say that doesn't stop me from feeling hopeless. But the right answer to that would be, well, take some steps in at least one of those directions. Small steps, daily steps. And don't upbraid yourself for the mundaneness of your efforts. You just said, you might want to turn your attention more to the local, and there's nothing heroic about that, but that's actually not true. In most situations, that's where the heroism lies. It's unheralded, but that's still the adventure of your life. It's the personal adventure of your life. And so that's where hope can be found. Can you make your relationships a little bit better? Can you make your career a little bit? And maybe that you have a revelation at some time and you decide that standard career isn't for you. That happened to you. You took an entrepreneurial route, and that's fine. But what you did was replace the traditional route, which would be to obtain something approximating a 9-to-5 job, with an entrepreneurial activity. You didn't just throw up your hands and say, well, the whole idea of being actively engaged with the world is so questionable that I'll just cease to do it. So I would say for people, they should adopt a conventional worldview and work towards optimizing their functioning along those conventional dimensions. And then if they discover that they have a really good reason to deviate, then they have the right to deviate. And I think you push at that in the first book when you offer the advice to people that it's okay for them to embrace their averageness. It sort of addresses the issue that you had brought up. You may discover that you are exceptional along some dimension and you can pursue that, but averageness beats the hell out of nihilism.
Yeah, absolutely. I know you had Matthew McConaughey on a few weeks ago, and one of the things that he said in his book that I really liked was he said that you've got to follow the rules before you can break the rules, and I think he even spoke of it politically. You got to be conservative before you can be liberal. You got to follow the rules before you can break the rules, and I think
that's called growing up.
Yeah, right.
Discipline first, and then exceptional.
Yeah. One thing I've found over the years, just talking to a lot of people, is that, and I think this comes back to the emotional aspect, is that, people who are suffering, because their suffering kind of pervades all of their life experience, they develop this irrational notion that the solution must be a massive, huge, life-altering event. Like they have to change everything from A to Z in one go. And the opposite is usually the case. Like it's often the difference between somebody being depressed and somebody not is something as simple as getting a job or making a new friend or moving out of your parents' basement. Like it's actually very basic things that have compounding effects. You
want to try those to begin with before you switch to a more radical solution.
Right.
It's like you might as well
Which comes back to your, I was going to say, it comes back to your, put your own house in order before you try to change the world.
Yes, and you want to rely on incremental solutions before you switch to revolutionary ones.
It's harder, though.
Yeah.
I mean, part of the reason people don't do that is because it's a lot easier. It's a lot easier saying, well, I'm against climate change than not arguing with your husband or trying to sort out the resentment between yourself and somebody else. That's way harder, and it's way easier to focus on something that's far away and out there.
Well, you also get a sort of perverse boost in relationship to your own self-perceived ethical stature. You know, if you're concerned about climate change, then you're someone taking on a global problem. If you're trying to figure out how not to argue with your husband about who's going to cook dinner, it's so mundane that it's almost laughable, right? But the difference between the first situation and the second situation is the second situation is real, and real advances can be made there, whereas the first situation just makes you faux virtuous. You're someone suffering for a noble cause, but the suffering isn't going to produce any benefit to anyone.
So put your house in order before you try and accomplish those kind of things. Make sure you're not harboring resentment for, I don't know, your significant other before you try and solve some global problem. In general?
Well, the thing is, one of the dangers of tackling a global problem when your house isn't in order is that you don't know what your solution is motivated by.
Could be by avoiding a problem, right?
It could be motivated by all sorts of things that you haven't dealt with. So, I mean, there's reasons that utopian political schemes go wrong, and those reasons often have to do with the unexamined, unconscious motivations of the people who are pushing the ideologies.
Okay, Mark, this is something that we kind of touched on earlier, and you were saying you had your mind changed about commitment, and I think you and I had similar thoughts because I kind of had the same perspective. It was like, I kind of had the same perspective. Anyway, one of the things, I have a kid, she's 3.5, and I've seen a lot of people my age who don't want kids, and part of the reason is because there's a sacrifice associated with it, and it's actually quite a large sacrifice. Like, even just being pregnant is hard the whole time, and then well, some people have it easier, but it's hard. And then the first year you're kind of glued to a baby, especially both parents, but especially if you're the mom. And so there's a lot of sacrifice, and my argument's been, yeah, but then you end up with a kid. Like, it's a lot of work, but then there's another human there. Like, that's pretty crazy. So
it's a good payoff.
Yeah, it's like a crazy payoff.
In principle, it's the best relationship you'll ever have. It's certainly the one that you have more opportunity with that relationship for it to be deep and meaningful than any other relationship you'll ever embark on.
You can force them to do chores.
Right, but an endless source of free labor.
Yeah.
And amusement. You can teach them things that aren't true and then laugh when they make a mistake.
Yeah. What are your thoughts? What are your thoughts on kids?
Well, I agree. And it's funny because I was one of those people, you know, back in my libertine life, you know, I was one of those people who was like, I don't think I ever want kids. It's a lot of work. It's a lot of effort. And right around kind of just all of these epiphanies, this whole period of my life where I came to a lot of these conclusions or discovered a lot of these ideas. It was funny, as soon as I kind of crossed that hurdle with my wife, the kid thing suddenly opened up. It was like within weeks of proposing to her, I'm like, wow, I think I want to be a dad. You know, I just felt it like very instinctually in my gut. And one of the things, you know, you said people complain about the sacrifice and how much work it is and how hard it is and how much you have to give up. And to me, it's like, that's the point. Like,
that's for sure, man. You have no idea how fortunate you are if you have a meaningful burden that you can lift. It's so... I've been very ill in the last year, and I haven't been able to undertake my normal ventures, and I miss it so much. I'm so grateful now when I can engage in something difficult, that I have the privilege of being able to engage in something difficult. And you want to thank your lucky stars that that's sitting there for you. It's so backwards to say, well, I don't want a kid because of the commitment and work. It's like, no, man, the commitment and work, that's where you're going to find the meaning. And then you get a kid too. This is a deal, man. You're one fortunate person if you're in that situation.
But I look back. So when I look back at, say, like 25-year-old Mark, and back when I had that mentality about kids, about marriage, I think part of the problem was I had never actually experienced that meaningful depth enough in my own life. Like, to me, I didn't know that existed, that was possible. As soon as I realized it was possible and it existed, hell yeah, like, sign me up for as much as I can handle. I think, I grew up in a dysfunctional family, and looking back, my relationship with my parents was quite dysfunctional. My relationship with my parents and my family in general, I don't think started to become somewhat healthy until my late 20s, early 30s. And that part of that just comes back to, it's not, they weren't in a healthy place either. Like, they grew up in dysfunctional family systems and situations. And so they were giving it their all and doing the best of what they knew, but it wasn't like an emotionally healthy environment.
I have a colleague who studies maternal behavior in rats. And one of the findings in her field, I can't remember if this is her finding or not, was that if you take rat pups away from their mother and provide them with the necessities of life, but deprive them of that maternal relationship, you can see disturbed maternal behavior in their children and their children's children three generations later. And that's with rats. And rats are complicated. And if you don't think so, you should try to build one. And they're pretty good. They're pretty good models of people when you compare them to your model of a person. And people deride animal research because rats aren't humans, but they share a lot of similarities. But we're way more dependent on our maternal and paternal relationships than even something as complicated as a rat. And it is a real loss, a real catastrophe. It's why it's so painful to me to see that our society doesn't understand that marriage isn't for the people who are married, it's for children. It's not about you once you have a child in a marriage. It's about the child. And that's actually a good thing too, because then for the first bloody time in your life, someone who isn't you is more important than you are. And that's such a relief. It's so appropriate. It's such a relief for that to happen. I
just want more of the inheritance.
Well, there's that.
I'm just going to beat Julian. It's like, I have
5. So I think, look, let me toss out another possibility here, and you tell me what you think about this. Well, I've been trying to figure out why my book was popular, my lectures, and I think part of the reason for that is that I've made a very strong case for the association between responsibility and meaning. Starting from the proposition that you need meaning in your life because life is hard. And so if it's meaningless suffering, and no one can tolerate that. So you need meaning, you need sustaining meaning. And the place to find that is in the adoption of responsibility. And that makes responsibility a solution rather than a problem. And, people might think of responsibility as the enemy of freedom, which we talked about already. But if responsibility is seen as the source of meaning, and I really believe that that's not only true, but testable, then responsibility starts to become a good thing very rapidly. And that's actually why you should grow up. It's because when you grow up and you adopt responsibility, your life is actually way better than it was before. So and you talked about growing up, and you said you need to get disciplined before you become free. That's a Nietzschean observation, by the way. That was something he stressed, not only in individuals, but in cultures. So he believed, for example, that the attempt by Europe to explain everything under the rubric of a single monotheism was a disciplinary strategy that enabled the modern mind to emerge. Because once you'd become disciplined enough to explain everything under one framework, you could start adopting other frameworks and do the same thing. So it's brilliant. But it was Nietzsche, so it's not surprising. Your book looks to me like it's likely to be particularly useful for people who are making the decision about whether or not to grow up?
I think so. What was the term you used earlier? Proximal development.
Yeah.
I think it's very much speaking to people who are on that cusp, kind of similar to how I was on that cusp in my 20s of like, okay, I'm achieving all of my worldly goals. I'm doing all the things that I imagined myself doing, when I was young. I'm doing well in the world, but why does it all seem so pointless? Why does it all seem so fleeting and superficial? And so I was very hungry for these ideas and this investigation. And I think there are a lot of people who are on that cusp of between, say, childhood and adulthood of recognizing that the way I describe it and everything is fucked is this transactional nature with the world of everything is about what can I get? If I behave this way, will I get appreciation or validation? If I behave that way, will I get more money or more status? I think people eventually tire of that worldview or seeing everything in those terms. And they feel like there must be something deeper and more profound or more important than that. And there is, but it requires these things that we're talking about: commitment, sacrifice, radical responsibility. And it's very counterintuitive in that way, because in the transactional nature of viewing the world, everything is about getting more, like gaining an advantage in business, gaining an advantage in your relationships, gaining more status and popularity, but to reach that kind of maturity and intimacy, you have to be willing to give up. You have to be willing to sacrifice. You have to be willing to let go of a lot of things. And I think that's when I just look, the more time I spend online and interacting with readers and especially talking to young people, it feels like that is the message that needs to be out there, and it's not out there enough. And I think I definitely have, you're preaching that message in a certain way and towards a certain demographic. And I think it kind of caught fire among some groups of people. I think I did a similar thing with a certain demographic. I think there's a lot of overlap. I mean,
you know what your demographic is? Just out of curiosity, or the main buyers of the book?
Yeah, it's about 55, 45 women to men.
55 women
in the 55 women.
Okay.
Which in the self-help world is a lot of men.
Right.
Most self-help books, it's like 80%, but it's slight majority women. It's primarily a millennial audience, although it does kind of drift up into Gen X and also down to Gen Z. It's about 50-50 North America and international. A lot of people in India, a lot of people in Brazil, a lot of people in kind of the developing world that is coming into its own. So India, Russia, Brazil.
How many languages has it been translated into?
About 60.
Yeah, so that's pretty much all the languages that there is a book market in. Yeah.
It's I think the last language I sold was Uzbek. So I don't think you can get more obscure than the Uzbek market.
Oh, now you're in trouble. You better be prepared for a flood of Uzbek hate mail.
Hate mail.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think this is the message. I believe very passionately that this is the message the world needs. And when I look at your work, Jordan, I think that you were also speaking to. I think part of why you took off so much was you were speaking to kind of an underserved demographic. I think it's one thing I've noticed in a lot of press and media that I've done and events I've done is that people are consistently shocked at how many young men show up and how enthusiastic they are. And it's a shock it's a shock of like, wow, why are all these meatheads here?
Yeah,
like,
I know. That's so appalling. It just,
do they read books?
It makes me nauseated, that attitude. And it is so contemptuous and so dismissive.
It is. And I think it's such an important, in terms of this sort of information, I think exposing young men to these questions about maturity, responsibility, emotional intelligence, commitment, I think it's an underserved demographic. And I think it's a demographic that was incredibly hungry for this material, and nobody realized it until a couple of years ago.
Well, it seems to me that men have to adopt responsibility voluntarily in a way that isn't precisely true of women. And I think that's because responsibility is thrust upon women in a way that it's not thrust upon men. For example, once they hit sexual maturity, they have to contend with the probability of getting pregnant. Now, men have to contend with the probability of getting someone pregnant, but that's not something of the same magnitude. And then when a woman has a baby, the baby either makes her responsible or tortures her to death. And it's not like having a baby isn't also responsibility for the father, but it's a much more escapable responsibility. And so what that means to me, and I've argued this for a long time, is that men have to be convinced, and this is the role of culture, men have to be convinced to grow up and take responsibility. And you can convince them by threatening them and by finger wagging at them and by punishing them if they fail to do so. And perhaps all those things are necessary to some degree, but it's much more effective to convince them in the manner that you were convinced, which is to say, look, you don't understand. The game you're playing, which is adolescent and immature, is not the best game in town. And although you might be cynical about the hallmarks of traditional maturation, that's a big mistake, because you're going to miss out on the adventure of your life if you stay that way for too long. And there's nothing, it's very, very sad to see someone who's 40 and who is still adolescent. And people who are in that situation suffer like mad. They're usually desperate enough to be depressed and suicidal. It's no picnic.
Yeah.
Okay, so your book, The Subtle Art of Not Giving a Fuck, is an investigation into values, which isn't nearly as good a title. And
right.
That'd be,
the way those two things are related is, and stop me if I'm wrong, okay, because I want to summarize what you've been doing and develop from there. What you're basically making the case that you have to get your values together. And what that means, from my perspective, is that you have to engage in the construction of a true value hierarchy. And not giving a fuck doesn't mean that you don't care about anything. It means that there are some things you really care about, and a lot of other things that you cease to care about because you have to, because you wouldn't be able to concentrate on those other things if you didn't. So it's a matter of getting your priorities straight.
Exactly.
Okay, and all this, and this is partly attested to by your concentration on Ernest Becker. So Becker concerns himself with the impact of our mortality on our consciousness, and it's Becker's observation, and many others, that the fact that we're limited and finite means that our life is composed in large part of suffering, anxiety, uncertainty, pain, shame, guilt. And we're very sensitive to negative emotion. We need something to offset that. So we need something of value to offset that. It's not optional. If you don't have that, you spiral downhill. So you don't have the option of believing in nothing, because then you get swamped by your pain. All right. Then you investigate. You say, well, you need to put your value hierarchy together, and you outline for your readers, at least in part, how that might be done. You say, taking responsibility. Okay, so there's some things that you should focus on and try to change. You can do that incrementally.
Yep.
So if you don't know where to start, you aim at something and you try to do something. And maybe you're not very good at that to begin with. That's the acceptance of failure, and you probably won't be, but that doesn't mean you shouldn't start. It's self-correcting. So the fact that I have a chapter in my new book that concentrates on a Jungian idea that the fool is the precursor to the savior.
Yeah.
And what that means is that if you're not willing to bumble around and make mistakes, you can never improve.
Absolutely.
You talked about the ability to discriminate. That's part of determining what's important and what isn't. And then the necessity of commitment, arguing the same thing essentially. And then the apprehension of death. And I suppose that's partly because to really test your value hierarchy, you have to see if it still retains its function even when you consider the finitude of your existence.
And a lot of values do not.
Yeah, they burn off.
A lot of things you can give a fuck.
Yeah, well, it isn't just death that does that. I mean, one of the things, there are worse things than death. And if you're fortunate, you have values that will see you through that. I mean, I've been hurt enough in the last year so that I learned that there were worse things than death. And I've been fortunate in that some of the things I've valued have kept me afloat. And all of those were oriented, they were all derived from responsibility. Responsibility to my family and responsibility to other people. That never ceased being important, even under the direst of circumstances. So I think that you and I, not only you and I, obviously, but we've been walking down the same road in some way, have been fortunate enough to engage in a conversation about what's fundamentally important, and that it's reasonable to propose that some of the reason for our mutual success is that we did realize that some things are important. That you're not a sap and a sucker to make the supposition that there are things worth committing to and that value is real.
Yeah. There's a great essay so David Foster Wallace is one of my favorite authors, and he had a great essay called E Unum Pluribus, which is kind of a play on the E Pluribus Unum. And in it, it's actually an essay about like literary critique, but he actually makes a lot of very pertinent observations about North American culture, Western culture in general, since, say, the 1960s. And he kind of walks through how, starting in the 60s and 70s, irony kind of took hold of pop culture. This idea of like being a rebel, being cool, being contrarian, like these were all things that probably, because they gained attention in the various mediums, they came to dominate pop culture. And within a generation, by his generation, he was Gen X, they kind of came to define the cultural values to a certain extent of, being ironic, being sarcastic, being too cool for school. And the essay actually ends in a very sad place where he talks about, this was written in 1992. He talks about, if we keep going down this path of essentially exalting ideas and narratives that tear the cultural structures down, that basically say like, that kind of set things on fire and then laugh about it and say like, oh, look how cool I am. And as long as we perpetuate these narratives that actually taking responsibility for something, or genuinely or authentically valuing something publicly, saying this is important to me, as long as we see that as something cheesy and worth deriding, he's like, this is going to take us to a very, very dark place. And I actually reread that essay recently, but it's something I've been thinking about nonstop for the last 6 months. And it's very similar to what you were saying, that it's, it's this authentically choosing something make important in your life, and standing by that, and making sacrifices for it, it's not going to win you any cool points. Like it's not going to get shared on social media all the time. It's
well, it's funny because it might.
Yeah, it looks like it's fairly popular.
It did for you. It did for me.
Did.
I know what you mean. I mean, that's not the story,
But I had to couch mine in snide and snarky humor. It's and I'm not lamenting that. I enjoy my humor, obviously, but like it's. Mm-hmm. One of the reasons I write one of the reasons it is called The Subtle Art of Not Giving a Fuck and not called The Importance of Choosing Your Values or something similar like that is because I found just from years writing online is that you have to package these ideas, or at least I do. This is what I found that worked, is that I had to package these ideas in a lot of kind of ridiculous, snarky jokes to get people to consume them. It was the sugar that makes the medicine go down, essentially, for people.
And that's interesting because it wasn't clear to me when I read the book. Like
that's the problem. That's kind of that's kind of the problem I had with it, because it doesn't like the ideas appeal to me, but that style didn't. Just to be like blunt about it. But I mean, you've sold 13 million books. Yeah. So it appeals to people.
Well, it's clearly not like, it's not a book that's doing harm. It is.
No. And it's not the ideas. It was just like, I was like, gee, does he need to say fuck all the time? Mm-hmm. But I'm just old now.
Well, it is. It's interesting.
Old and worn down.
Nietzsche said, great men are seldom credited with their stupidities. And what he meant by that was, you don't know how much bad has to be packaged along with something good in order for the good to be able to exist. And that's not a justification for what's bad, but it is an entreaty not to jump to conclusions too quickly. And Mikhaila's observation that, she reacted in a particular way to the style of the book, but then had to contend with the fact that it's been unbelievably widely read.
Well, and I agreed with, I read it and was like, yeah, I agree with, there are a lot of points in here that I agree with. It was just I just couldn't exactly figure out what you were doing with the way you were writing. I was like, why? Yeah. It's funny too. And I know that you have a bit of a background in comedy, but part of what I was thinking throughout reading it was, why is it written this way? Maybe it's effective.
Maybe that is a zone of proximal development issue as well.
But he said his market is millennial.
Right. But what Mark said, I believe, is that, maybe what you did with your style was give people permission to think about the deeper issues that you were raising by adopting an ironic tone.
Yeah, and he made it cool, right? You made it cool. You snuck it in with a bunch of cool stuff.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah.
Right.
It has a cool title. The book is cool on the outside too. So that was obviously a brilliant idea. It worked.
Yeah, I mean, and it's for what it's worth, Mikhaila. I mean, a lot of people have the same criticism. They say the same thing. They're like, I love the ideas, but do you really have to be like such a sarcastic asshole all the time? And it's, I mean, on the one hand, it's like, okay, this is just how I like to. This is the sort of stuff that I find funny, so I enjoy putting it in. But on the other hand, it's
well, apparently other people do too.
They do, but it was actually very interesting, because my book came out about 2 years before yours, Jordan's, and it was very interesting watching your book take off so much, because it is, so serious and very straight to the point. There's absolutely no ambiguity of what you're getting at in any of your chapters. And, there were part of me, read that, and it's like, and I was like, wow, how does he do this? It's like, I've never found a way to not kind of couch it in that language and have people take me seriously. It might just be my style of communicating.
Well, it's a hard question because, one of I realized something a long time ago when I was teaching in Boston. I was teaching a very, very serious course. The subject material was brutal. It was a course that focused a lot on atrocity, and it was based on my first book, Maps of Meaning. And I had this voice in the back of my head constantly that said, you know, if you had really mastered this material, you could teach it with a light touch. You could inject some humor. And I know that I'm at my best when I have a sense of humor about what I'm talking about, no matter how serious what I'm talking about is. And, you know, you did manage to maintain a sense of humor while discussing topics that are very serious. And it might be reasonable to debate about whether the humor goes too far or whether it's sufficiently sophisticated. Or I think that's irrelevant in some sense, because the success of the book speaks for the utility of the approach.
Also, who cares if one person is like, "Meh, you said fuck too much."
Yes, well,
what?
I totally
yeah, well,
agree.
that's why it's useful to consider your reaction in light of the fact that it also sold 13 million copies. But it is interesting that you have some conscious sense that by playing, maybe it's also to some degree that you showed that you were able to play the ironic game. You know, sometimes people who are serious because they can't be funny. They can't joke. They can't be one of the crowd. They can't be one of the guys. And so they make the claim that their seriousness should trump that, but it doesn't. But by adopting that tone that you adopted, you did say, well, look, I can play the ironic game, but I found something better. And maybe that's part of what makes the book convincing.
Yeah, because there are a lot of other books with "fuck" in the title now. I can tell you that.
Yeah, I've seen that a lot.
Congratulations, you've contributed one more to the degeneracy of North American culture.
You're welcome, society.
Thank you so much for coming on. That was really fun. That was a very, very enjoyable podcast. Where can people go to find you?
markmanson.net. I've got hundreds of free articles. And then obviously the books are in every bookstore. So just keep an eye out. But yeah, that's pretty much it.
Well, thank you very much for coming on. That was fun.
Thanks for having me. It was a pleasure.
Yeah, it was really good to meet you.
You too.